So thank you so much for being with us. We, at the Community Sector Council, we've been looking forward to having either a workshop or a panel discussion on operating and other reserves for nonprofit groups for a couple of years now. So my name is Darlene Scott. I work at the Community Sector Council in a variety of roles. And right now I am with Shelley White, who's the woman at the back of the room in Shelley Martin, the woman in white at the back of the room, co-coordinating a really interesting project called Buy the Books with a $ in place of an S, because what we're trying to deal with is financial management issues for nonprofit organizations. So that's Shelley, you can say hello to her, and she's actually going to come up and speak to you at the end of the panel about the FM Share, which is what we're calling the network that we're pulling together of financial managers. I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of other CSC staff who are in the room before we get to the panel. And one would be Jason Smith, who's down in the corner, who's going to be taking some pictures. So if you don't want your picture taken, be sure and give him, you know, the big X sign, because we do have a website and we like to put, we like to record our events. So if the picture is taken, there's a large possibility that it might end up in a photo album on the website. Nishaba Sheikh, you met at the front desk. She's the person who helped check you in, so thanks for being with us. And I'm really happy to have Lori Johnson, the office manager accountant at the Community Sector Council with us, and she's a person who gives us wise counsel on finances every day, so glad to have you with us as well, Lori. Now at the Community Sector Council we do tweet, and we're using most of the social media, so if you tweet this afternoon, I know you're going to keep your cell phones kind of off to the side, but if you do tweet, feel free to tweet at CSCNL and tag us, we'd appreciate that, and we'll retweet your stuff too. And I know that pretty much everybody in the room is very familiar with the Community Sector Council's website, but just to let you know that we are videoing this afternoon's panel discussion, and we will be putting it up in our resource center. So if you look to the left-hand side of the CSC website, you'll see what we call a resource center, and above that, all of our programs are listed out, and there's one tag there for Buy the Books, and we will be putting the video up at one of the pages that you can click through to there. So I want to get you to the panel fairly quickly, but I do want to address how we're going to work out this afternoon. We're going to be together for about 2 hours. Our panel is going to be chaired by Penny Rowe, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. We have about an hour for the panelists to speak to you. They've all met with us in advance. They've kind of prepped some of their chat. They shared some of their handouts with us, which have showed up in your kits. So they're prepared to speak a few minutes each, and we know that that's going to eat up about an hour. And then what we'll do is we'll actually take a break, but it's not too much for relaxation. It's more figure out what questions you might want to ask the panelists, and we actually have question sheets to help you on your work tables there. And then when we come back after that sort of networking break, and we'll have a few refreshments, some cookies and fruit, what we want you to do is engage in a back and forth. It's a panel discussion, so the panel's going to present first, then you can do some networking, and then when you come back, let's get some good old question and answer, some back and forth going. And we will have you out by 4, but just before we leave, Shelley will talk to you about FM Share. So it's time to meet our panelists, and I'm really, really glad that everybody that we invited to attend the panel agreed immediately. So I'm delighted at the caliber that we have in front of you today. So get your questions ready, and I'll introduce you to each one of them individually. So at my left is Penelope Rowe. We work with Penny, so we know her quite well, and she's kind of hard to introduce because she has a long and strong biography, an exceptional one actually, in terms of local involvement in the community sector. But I'd like you to think of her as a person who has an incredible amount of national experience in our sector as well. She's works hard behind the scenes for groups like Imagine Canada and Volunteer Canada. She has been very active on the SHIRK Advisory Committee panel. So Penny has a depth of experience that I hope you're going to be able to mine today. She also locally chaired the workers' compensation panel for quite a few years, which was an incredible volunteer commitment on her part. And she certainly got used to handling money at workers' comp. If you didn't get it in the nonprofit sector, you would get it there for sure. And CSC is an organization that does have reserves, and Penny has been a leader in terms of giving us direction, obviously. Also, I'd like you to say hello to Tammy Davis. Tammy is the executive director of United Way Newfoundland and Labrador. So you and I know her quite often as a funder. And in fact, one of the handouts that you have in your package is a reserve policy that United Way Canada uses across the country. But Tammy, too, is a volunteer. She spent time in her career at Memorial University, but has been giving back ever since she joined United Way with volunteer time at organizations like Telus Atlantic, in Homelessness St. John's, and where I know her mostly from, and that's the Association of Fundraising Professionals. So welcome to Tammy. Say hello also to Laura Wardle, CPA. Now, Laura is a senior manager at Grant Thornton. She has lots of experience horizontally and vertically, I would think, with nonprofits, with governments at various levels, including municipalities, which is a kind of an interesting take because reserves are actually mentioned in the Municipalities Act. And Laura, in addition to being working her way through everything that needs to be done at Grant Thornton, finds the time to volunteer as well, and she is actually on the advisory committee for the Buy the Books project. Brian Scammell is with us today. Brian has an inquiring mind. When we were developing for Buy the Book, the very first, and we were about to launch it, a directory for accountants and nonprofits, Brian called me and said, hey, I want to be in that directory. So I really appreciated that. He has lots of public and private experience, and he's been a chartered business valuator since 2002. So he's currently in private practice in St. John's, and I guarantee you, Brian, you'll be in the directory. Say hello also to Josh Quinton. Josh is from St. John's. Now, he spent about a decade down in New York at Bloomberg's telling the Americans how to run things. That worked out well, right, Josh?
Before Trump, yes.
Yes, let's say yes, BT before Trump.
Yeah.
He still has connections with New York through the International Grenfell Association, so lots of volunteer experience on this panel. Josh serves on the Shorefast and the Shorefast Social Enterprise boards, but right now his full-time work is with Wood Gundy at CIBC. So I think that we have a great panel, and I'm actually going to, whoops, I should have moved this along, sorry about that. I'm going to turn it over to Penny actually to get things going and make sure that we have a great panel discussion. And the only slide I'm going to leave up there now is on unrestricted net assets, which is basically the area you're going to have some time or some place to deal with reserves. So over to you, Penny, and up to you to chair your panel.
Thank you.
You're kindly welcome. Do you want to take it away?
Oh, you could take that. Thanks, Darlene. It's always a pleasure to have people who are associated with us at CSC taking on this kind of initiative. Darlene has been talking about reserves. Now for a while, we did a study about 3 years ago with 45 organizations in the city of St. John's and environs. And one of the things that we looked at was how many organizations had reserve funds. I think the bigger question is how many don't have reserve funds, and all of the challenges that are presented to us as we talk about the importance of having some stability in our sector. So I'm just going to say I'm a woman on a mission. I actually believe this is one of the most important conversations we can have in our sector. We're all being told as good community organizations about how important we are to the economy, about how important we are to our population, about how we really need to see ourselves as an equal player with government and with the private sector. So those are all very important admonitions that are presented to us. The question is, how do we do that? Many of us know that instability of funding and lack of security really has a huge impact, or at least so we think, on being able to maintain employees in our sector, for example. So my main mission is that I'm absolutely convinced, and I'm hoping over the course of the next year or two to make sure that everybody in this province has the same belief that we do at CSC, namely that the community sector is absolutely central to economic and social progress in our province. And if we believe that, then we have to start thinking about how we maintain our organizations to keep that responsibility alive and to be able to do our jobs well. So what we're hoping to achieve here today, and it doesn't matter whether you're in the arts community, whether you're cultural organizations, museums, health services, social services, it doesn't matter at all what kind of an organization you are if you are doing something which is critically important for your clients, for your members, and for the public, and for your communities. The arguments for having good reserve funds are the same, regardless of where you get your money, how you get your money, or who you serve. So I think that's really the important piece that we need to keep in mind. I'm actually delighted to have such a great group of panelists with us so that we can make sure that we get the whole array of thinking put on the table. So I come from the perspective of being the CEO of an organization. My interest is running our organization in a way that is sustainable, that's healthy, and that enables us to be strong and to maintain good core staff in our organization and to do the things that we need to do in a well-established and some sort of a sustainable manner. Other people on the panel are coming from different perspectives, which is really neat because they will tell us, okay, if you want to do it, this is what you have to know about how to do it. One of the challenges that the Community Sector Council had right from its inception was the fact that we never had core funding. We weren't the kind of organization that could fundraise, so we had to live by our wits. And we learned very early that the way we lived was on project funding and from year to year. And there came a time after we had been in place for maybe 10 or 12 years where I woke up at the end of March going into the 1st of April. And we had money we were returning because the projects were over. And on the 1st of April, we didn't know whether we were going to have a single cent. And so typically boards of directors get very nervous and they say, well, you've got to reduce your expenses, you've got to reduce your staff, etc. I said, we can't live like that. It's simply not a proper way to manage an organization. And one of the things that I've always valued in our organization is that we've always had a board that has been enormously supportive of its employees and supportive of the importance of having a kind of an innovative culture around us so we could do things. We actually established our first fund in 1989. And we set it up then as a contingency fund. And that was really just to give us a little bit of a buffer to get us through some short-term hurdles. We were very fortunate in that we've been running a successful social enterprise, and so we had funds that we were able to transfer into our fund. We got smarter and better and more clever as we progressed, of course, and we suddenly realized, as some of you constantly raise, well, if we have money in the bank, aren't the funders going to prevent giving us more money? Major concern of our organizations. So I started thinking about it, and Darlene mentioned I was chair of the board of workers' compensation, and suddenly this word of liability was in my lexicon. And it suddenly occurred to me that we didn't have a contingency fund. What we had was a fund to meet the expenses that the board had already agreed to. So if we had benefit plans for our employees, or we said you can build a certain number of sick days, we had to have the money in the bank to cover those costs. The minute we started putting money in the bank, I was challenged by a deputy minister, why do you need our money? You got that money in the bank. And that's when I learned how to explain what we were doing. And I only ever had to do it once. To their credit, they never pushed back on us again. So the fear that many of our organizations have, and the way in which some of us try to hide our money. I mean, we had conversations with huge organizations last week who were always trying to figure, how do we hide it so nobody knows we got it? And so I think we need to stand up and say, we want to be businesslike, and you should value organizations that are running well, rather than trying to push us back and say, oh, you know, run by the seat of your pants all the time, and don't worry about whether you're doing a good job. because if you do, we're going to take your money. So that's a major drive that we have to deal with. I'm going to wrap up now, Darlene, I know my time is just about over. So what I'm hoping now to hear from the rest of our panelists is how to do it. I hope I've made the case, in the few short minutes I've had, that this is a very important planning function. And we shouldn't be lily-livered about it. We should be prepared to stand up and say, if you want strong organizations that are going to play a fundamental role in this province, then you have to be prepared to allow us to run ourselves in a business-like manner, which means that we need to have the financial capacity to take us through certain storms. We need to have the financial capacity to do the things that we need. And in my view, it is to keep really good, strong employees in place so that they can do the things that they're very good at. So now I'm going to move along to Tammy, but I'm just looking at Darlene Strong. There was one thing that you wanted me to do and I haven't done it. There was only one thing you told me you wanted me to talk about, different kinds of funds.
Oh, yeah.
So, in my mind, there are liability contingency funds, which is the kind I just mentioned, that we put in place at CSC initially. Then we said, oh, we got that money in the bank. This was a good move. Let's now have another fund, which we call a project fund. You could call it an operating reserve. You can call it whatever you want to. But it is a fund that is guided by very clear board policies, which says that money is there for our board to determine it can spend when it wants to move us in a new strategic direction. It's also there to enable the board at the beginning of the year. Now, most of you won't probably have boards like this. Our board will always support at the beginning of the year, on paper, a significant operating deficit, because we generate our funds throughout the course of the year. And if I came in at the beginning of the year with a flat budget, break-even budget, I would be lying. So this allows us and allows our board to bear the responsibility of giving us time to make up the difference without any significant responsibility on their part, because the money is in the bank. And the third kind of fund, which maybe is of interest to some of you, is a capital fund, where you're setting aside money to do something quite explicit that is a capital expenditure. I think we're going to have Tammy speak next, and Tammy is going to speak from the perspective of somebody who provides funding to the community sector. And I'm just going to make one final comment to our panelists. I agreed to chair the panel, but only on condition that I was a chair with benefits, and that I could interrupt and do whatever I wanted. I'm sure that we get all the information out from all of you, because I know you all have great information to share.
Are we doing it from
You
here?
can do it from wherever you like.
I'll do it from here. Since my voice probably carries anyway, so if anybody has any issue with hearing me. Thank you for having me here. I was actually quite surprised when Shelley called me to ask me to sit on a panel about reserves, because I'm definitely not the expert. You'll have to look to the left and to the right for the technical information, and based on the pre-event feedback, I think most of your questions are about, you know, setting up reserves and the implications and things like that. So, you know, what I can tell you is that as an organization, we do not, United Way does not actually currently have a reserve policy. So it's something that we are working on right now as well. We do, through our national body, actually with our last audit, received word, you know, that we need to look at how much cash we're carrying at the end of our fiscal year. But it's actually, you know, it's smoke and mirrors in the United Way world, because we receive with the pattern that we receive our funding, we may look like we have, you know, $750,000 at the end of March, but it's all spent by, you know, the end of June, because that's the granting cycle that we're in. We receive our funds and then we have to disperse them. So that's how it works with us. But when we are evaluating applications for funding, I think that's the important part that people want to hear here. We do look at, you know, the financial statements, and one thing that helps us is if it's an audited financial statement, because things are in, you know, certain places and you have to look. If you're with an organization that does a review or no audit, it makes it that much more challenging for us to be able to accurately evaluate what your financial position is. We would look at both, whether it appears that you have in excess of, a year's operating fund in unrestricted reserves. Restricted reserves would be different because they'd be there for a specific purpose, and that's not to run the programs or services that you might be asking for us for funding. But if you have, a excess of funding unrestricted reserves, need is a criteria for us. So that would certainly color, the comparison when we're looking at an organization that does not have the unrestricted reserves available to them. We also look, and if there's an organization with no reserve, it also calls into question then the stability and the permanence of that organization, and whether that's the place that you want to invest donor dollars. Because, if they're in a precarious situation, will they be there in 6 months to actually use the funds that we've allocated? And if they aren't, then, we have to look at reputation management as well. So we're investing donor dollars, not our own money. So we have to report back to them. But for us, we try to keep any unrestricted operating reserves that we have, we have some in a short-term GIC. So that allows us to be fairly liquid and to be able to access that within a short time while still earning some money from that. So that's sort of how we handle ourselves internally currently. It's interesting to note that United Way Worldwide is on this, but United Way does not have any requirement for us to have an operating reserve. So it's very interesting. This is about, I think, the capacity building that United Way does as an organization within its, the various communities. And I think what it speaks to for us is that, if we're going to talk the talk, we also have to walk the walk. And I think Penny and I had a conversation about a year ago when we were talking about this issue of liabilities. And it really highlights, I think, the need as a nonprofit who you are going from year to year. We're in the same situation. We're not guaranteed that we're going to get any funding. We receive, I think, about $1,200 from government. That's all we get on an annual basis. So, we have to ensure that we have our liabilities covered if for some reason you have to shut the doors, and that's, sort of a worst case scenario. But that's, I think, the position that a lot of people are in when they're looking at establishing a operating reserve. So, my comments and my experience here is certainly different than the CPAs and the accountants that can offer some technical expertise. But, it is something that as a funder we review, and it's the unrestricted that has the most impact on that yes or no and the need sort of evaluation. And unless we know specifically, we have to go by what you are presenting. So the methods that you're using to present your reserves is key when you're applying for funding. So, trying to hide it and not call it something will muddy the waters and likely lead to a no when you may have been in a situation where funding was, needed. So I encourage you all, if you're not currently doing at least a review, to look at that as an option for your organization.
So Tammy's last point, and the point you made earlier, Tammy, about the issue of unrestricted funds, speaks very heavily to when you establish a fund, to having very clear guidelines as to what that fund is for and why it's there, because then it becomes something very different than just having a whole bunch of unappropriated funding in your books.
If 2 years ago, I'll use Rainbow Riders for example, if 2 years ago Rainbow Riders was presenting financial statements with $2 million in a capital campaign revenue not shown in a restricted fund, we would say, well, they have $2 million, why aren't they using that money? But if it's a capital fund for future use, then you know that this is something that's been, planned and approved by the board for use in the future. So this is where the accountants are necessary.
And so why don't we just move along to Laura, who's with Grant Thornton, as Darlene said, and thanks very much for coming, Laura, for being willing to share some of your wisdom with us.
You're welcome. Brian and I, being both CPAs, are gonna sort of work off of each other. Basically, at this point, now that you know what kind of reserves are out there, what ones might be useful to you, we are gonna address what that might actually look like on the statements and what kinds, and how they show up on the statements depending on the type of reserve you have.
Okay, I'm actually gonna stand up. Because I don't have eyes in the back of my head and I don't have a mirror. So on the balance sheet of your organization, you know, there's, you're gonna see assets, liabilities, and then equity. And I guess we have this category here, it says, you know, unrestricted net assets. So what that is, this could be, for example, if it's not available, in other words, not available for designation by the board. Typically what that is you might have an organization that is very, say, real estate rich, and there are a few in town, okay, like in NPOs. And they might have, you know, $2 million in real estate on the books, okay? If what they've done is, or can do, is in the equity section, sort of have a separate section for investment in capital assets, because otherwise it gives the impression they get $2 million in cash or something, or liquid assets floating around. So even though they might have a high level of equity, a lot of it's taken up with real estate. Okay? So that's typically what you, and it normally would be called investment in capital assets, and Laura will show the balance sheet coming up after this one. It sort of gives an example of that. And the other one is sort of available. So unrestricted net assets available for designation by the board. So again, and it's been alluded to earlier by Tammy and probably by Penny, in one case we have board designated. So that's sort of special purpose funds, like you got a plan for it, whether it's been a discipline fund, education fund, building fund, or whatever. It's been earmarked, but it's not really operating. It's not meant to be operating money. A little bit. A little
Let's make a
louder.
video too.
Okay, sorry. With so board designated, I can hear it different. Special purpose funds. Sort of board designated operating. Again, you might have an example where, okay, we have a discipline fund or education fund or something, so that might be an example of that. The difference is that the board has said we want to spend a certain amount of money for this purpose, and we're earmarked it now, and we're going to set aside, you know, dollars to match the fund. And then undesignated operating funds, that's what Tammy would have alluded to earlier. It's sort of the unrestricted net assets. So it hasn't been externally designated for, or sorry, internally designated for a special purpose. It's not an investment in capital assets, it's your general reserve, everything else. So that's typically what you would see. On the next slide, there's a balance sheet which I'd like Laura to speak to.
Yeah.
You want to take this? Because apparently we need it.
You're like in a singing competition.
There you go. I can understand it.
All right, so I'm just going to take you through, this is what a balance sheet, or what we call a statement of financial position, is called. So you have your cash up here, and your receivables, your investments, all your assets are up here, and then your current liabilities, your accounts payable. And if you come down to about here, there's a balance called deferred contributions. And that is where you would put your contributions that you've gotten for expenses that you haven't actually made yet. So if you got money to invest in a certain program that hasn't started yet, or you've gotten money, in one of our examples of questions people asked, they referred to a program where they were saving up money to buy a guide dog.
We don't have a copy of this, do we?
This slide?
Yeah. Is that in our home?
No, we can get it for you though, Gerald.
Yeah. So this is where, yeah, so this is where if you were saving up money to buy the guide dog for the program, you take your contributions that you got from your donors and put them in here until the year that you actually were able to accumulate enough money to make the cash expenditure. And then that year, it would show as an expense on your income statement as well as the revenue from your donations. And then in this category, this is where you show your separate funds. In this example, there's an endowment fund, but otherwise you have your investment in capital assets, and then you're internally restricted for special projects. That could also be a reserve fund, it could be your operating reserve fund, anything that you're going to take that's not externally restricted, that's not a restriction when you get the money, you can break up down here into whichever way the board wants to spend the money. So usually the board would approve what gets categorized in each of these categories.
So while we have you two speaking, one of the interesting things that I've often remarked as we're talking about reserve funds, and I made the point, I think when I spoke, that what's important is to plan to put money aside, whether it's for a restricted fund or whether it's for operating funds. One of the challenges that I see, and I thought I heard you say something that, you know, like if you're saving up money for a guide dog, something very specific. Do you have to wait till the end of the year when you have a surplus to put the money in? That's always challenging to me, because if you're sitting with a surplus on your financial statement, then that can be viewed negatively by your funders as well. You don't go digging deep into your financial statements. So my question is, is there a way to do this? So if the board says we have to plan to have a guide dog, we have to have a plan for an operating fund, can we do that on a regular basis rather than saying, oh, we better plan for a surplus and then we'll put so much of it aside?
So basically, I mean, what Penny would be talking there would be a sort of, I mentioned earlier, this unrestricted net assets. So that's like a general catch-all. So you could make, the board can make a decision that they want to, is what we call in accounting lingo, an appropriate, you know, some of this amount. So it's $2,105,000. So if we wanted to say, set up, you know, $100 for, or $100 for a guide dog, then on a separate statement, another statement in net assets, it would come out of that unrestricted fund and set up a new fund called, say, guide dog or something.
But Brian, I think you're talking about when you're doing the year-end statements.
Well, no, the board could, this would be a board thing. Like, they could make, you know, decisions during the year knowing that they're doing well.
So could they have a line saying guide dog expense?
Well, it wouldn't be an expense. That's something we come across a lot. Like, to create these funds, I'm glad Shelley is nodding because that's comforting to me.
Shelley has had this out.
Shelley's also Shelley's a CPA that she teaches at the business school. She taught my son, so it's very comforting that she's nodding. So that's a very common misconception. They want to create a fund, and so, oh, we'll just expense that in your normal operating statement. That's not the way to do it. What you have to do is, you know, you have your regular revenue and expenses, say get your net profit or loss for the year, and then normally that net profit or loss would flow into your unrestricted net assets, so that's fine. So let's put numbers to it. If it was a $100 profit, so now this $21.05 becomes $22.05, okay? And then you're saying, we're going to make an appropriation now to this guide dog fund. So really, you're just moving money from one equity account to the other.
So the bottom line is that you
The bottom line
plan for a
stays the same.
surplus. You have to plan for a surplus so you have something available to put in.
Well, I think it would be really weird if you wanted to make this appropriation, and then but to do it, you ended up putting your unrestricted net assets in a deficit position. That would strike me kind of strange.
So you are planning for a surplus so you have money to flow.
Yeah, but you could do that. I mean, to be board directives, that's certainly something that Laura or I would ever say you guys should do this type of thing. You know?
But in certainly a lot of the reading that I've done, it says you have to plan for a surplus so you have something available to transfer in.
Yeah, you'd have to budget so much at the beginning of the year.
Sure.
We hope to put in $5,000 if
Exactly.
we raise it. Yeah.
But I guess if you put it in your budget, is it truly a surplus?
Well, that's really why I'm asking for the,
Right.
why I like the idea of the budget
Yeah.
line.
Yeah.
Well, you can have, I mean, you know, in your internal budget, I suppose you
Right.
can have a line called contingency fund or
Yeah.
guide dog fund or whatever you want to do in your budget. It's just that in the external statements, it wouldn't present that way.
So you
Yeah.
could, that's a really important thing you just said,
Yeah.
you can budget for it.
Sure.
Yeah, because a surplus in a budget is not the same as surplus for accounting.
Right.
Because your budget's gonna be cash-based when you get your money in and out, whereas your accounting is an accrual-based, so you'd have accounts receivable, payable at the end of the year.
And so the advantage of doing it in your budget, it seems to me, is that you're always thinking about the fact that you want to do it, you're planning to do it, and you think it's a priority.
I don't see there's any different, Penny, than if your own household, you know? You got a certain amount of income, you got a plan for, you know, uncertainty, job loss, sickness, or whatever. So really, translate that to the charity life. And, you know, Penny, I think you mentioned earlier that, you know, you had this surplus or something and you were challenged by the provincial government, but, you know, you were able to convince them because you had a plan. And that would certainly be the same with CRA too. You know, if you can say, look, we're not just keeping money because we like to keep money, we have a use for this money. I just want to point out one other, oh, go ahead.
I know it's not a question, Tom, but I just wanted to add one comment.
Yeah.
So what you do with these restrictions, restricted assets, we make a note of that, right? In the financial statements.
So what would happen, do you want to do that? Or, so what would happen is you have a statement of net assets, it's a separate statement. You have a balance sheet and a statement of revenue and expenditures, and then you got a statement of net assets. And it explains, I guess the simplest way to explain it, is you have a statement that explains the changes from 150 to 170, or from 205 to 140 to 205. It's just a statement that shows, okay, we took this much money from unrestricted and we're setting up this other fund. You know, it just gets you from A to B.
And it would show which fund the internal transfer happened in, if it went from your
And so
unrestricted.
it's like really important what money is legitimately put into a fund. In other words, what's unfettered compared to the funding you might have that has, from a funder that has restrictions on it.
Right.
Yes.
One concept, external restriction.
Yeah, so there's concept, there's two different concepts. There's internally restricted, where it's designated by the board. And then there's externally restricted, which is when your donor tells you that we're giving you this money, but it has to be explicitly used for XYZ. In the latter case, where you can only use it on specific expenditures, it would have to be, in this example, be recorded in these deferred contributions until you'd actually met the terms of the agreement. If you bought the guide dog, then that's when this would suddenly become revenue and you'd have your expense. If it's internally restricted, when you got the money, it would still run through your revenues, and it would end up in your unrestricted net asset line, and then the board could decide, if it hasn't already budgeted it, then decide how it's going to allocate it sort of below the line, so within your net assets category.
I just have one more comment. I just want to explain, so I mentioned investment in capital assets. So in this example, it says, you know, $1,128, right? But that's not the equity that you see, it's only $205. The difference is this is really your investment in capital assets. So it's whatever the depreciated value of your equipment or your real estate or property equipment, whatever, less the current mortgage that you might have on it, say $825, less this is the $43, which is, say, somebody gave you money to buy fixed assets. It's really the arithmetic that you've got to take this minus the other two. So it's certainly a way, though, so rather than say, oh, you know, we got $2.8 million, by segregating it out, you can see, look, some of this is not liquid assets here, it's tied up in our real estate.
So what we've had so far is the case for why you should have reserve funds. Now we have some of the detail about how we handle reserve funds. And so let's assume that we've found the money and we've got our reserve funds and we want to make some more money and we need to invest those funds in an appropriate manner. So for example, when the Community Sector Council started its first fund, one of the first things that we said, once we attained the ceiling in our fund, that any revenue profit we made off those investments in any given year came back into operating funds. So it was a way for us to generate additional revenue. So Josh, thanks very much for coming, and tell us now what we do and how you can see we can make more than a lowly 0.8% on some guaranteed income certificate.
We'll talk on that, and thanks for having me, everybody. I'm here on a personal perspective and a professional perspective, and obviously I serve on about 6 volunteer boards, so I'm usually the finance person that's brought in to help people understand. And the thing that I want to make sure what's shown on this slide here in your presentations is something that I think is not well taught in our education system in this province. And now that I've moved on, I'm hopeful to tell people that the government of Canada, the Bank of Canada through it is actively trying to increase the price of everything you purchase every year by 2%. So that's the green line you see on this chart here. And you can see the last few years it's been a little bit below 2%, hovered around 1.5%, and now it's notched up, and you notice that in your groceries, your gasoline, things you're buying every day. I just want to make sure that if you don't remember anything I teach you today, the government is actively trying to increase the price of everything you purchase every year by 2%. So for me personally, when I'm on a number of these charity boards and nonprofit boards, I get very nervous when I'm on volunteering with an organization that doesn't have some form of an investment account, because I usually know that it's going to resolve in a phone call to me at some point with a leak in the roof and an immediate need to raise tens of thousands of dollars to stop the leak in the roof or whatever the case might be. So remember that as I talk about the rest of the side. Obviously, we went through some of my volunteer work. I'm on the board of the International Rental Association, the U.S. entity, and we were fortunate enough, we've been around for 100 years, obviously long before I was born. But what we do is we invest the money in the market. And every year we donate roughly $1 million or so to the Northern Peninsula, Coastal Labrador, through our investments in the equity markets. And it's something I'm very actively involved with. And it's done us very well. And obviously we've been around for 100 years and we continue to be around, and we don't have to actively fundraise anymore. And we have not fundraised for decades and decades now, because our money is invested in the market and returns a safe level that keeps up with the inflation rate I've shown, and also keeps up with the markets. We don't have a very aggressive market; it's a very balanced portfolio. So on the next slide, which I'll start to bring up briefly, I just wanted to show you a quick chart of how the Canadian market has done, and you'll see a lot of zip-saw. I mean, this is not what you want to see. It's been a volatile 10 years in the Canadian investment world. So you can see years where the market was down 35%, and then the next year it was up 30%. So major swings in the equity market. This doesn't take into account dividends, but it's just simple price appreciation. And you can see this year we're down 3.7%. So if you were to invest the money in the equity markets, and obviously in the Canadian example here, you can see that there will be some volatility in that, and you need to make sure that you're either build a defensive portfolio, which strongly suggests, particularly in the nonprofit space, and that's traditionally how we would do that, is how you look at it. So you can, have some amazing years where you do very well, but you have to be prepared for the down years as well. That inevitably does happen in the market as well. The one thing I wanted to touch on was, we talked about GICs, a number of you mentioned GICs. So obviously I think GICs is better than sitting in a bank account trying to keep up that 2% target. I checked the rates today. They're like about 1.7 today is what you can get in GIC, cashable GIC. So if you want guaranteed government money that is backed by the government of Canada, up to $100,000, you should know that is guaranteed money that can be taken out. The challenge comes when you try to cash those out early. If there's a need, there's some challenges around getting that full value. But it is guaranteed. So everybody says there's no free money in this world. It's not true. In my world, in the investment world, there is free money. That is
some more free than others.
Yeah, exactly. So it's there is free money in the world. It just happens to come in the form of the investment world. So that is backed and guaranteed by the government of Canada. The TSX overall, just while this is up here, the sad number for the Toronto Stock Exchange over the last 10 years is a return of 1.68%. So it hasn't been a good 10 years on a net basis. So if your portfolio manager is doing better for you than that, then
It is, isn't it?
congratulations.
When the GIC is performing better than TSX.
Exactly. So you need to be prepared for some of the movements, particularly, or really diversify globally to where there's a bigger economy than the Canadian economy. The U.S. obviously has done exceptionally well for the last number of years under Barack Obama and now his new predecessor. One thing I want to talk about briefly, particularly for nonprofits, is when people give money to charities. That often happens, particularly, we see a lot of this with the university, people want to make donations back to universities. We were discussing the tax implications in Canada versus my experience in the US, I don't know it perfectly, but generally you can donate securities to charities and there's not as much tax implications. I can look into that for you as well. But what is interesting is we, in the investment world, will set up things for anything $25,000 or more can be set up to be, a Jane Doe charity in honor of XYZ that will, you can set a spending rate, a target rate of whatever you'd like that to see, and you can pay out 4 to 8% or so per year. That, obviously if you do well and invest well, you can do in perpetuity forever. So it is something you should certainly consider as you move forward with that. You have to create an investment policy statement, you have to have an investment committee. So there is more onus on your boards, and obviously have somebody who sits on 6 investment policy committees. I understand the time that's required for that, so it does expand some of your boards to have some more financial people on them generally, or talented CPAs. So do consider that as you go through as well. So those are most of the main points I wanted to talk about, but please keep up with inflation. Otherwise, the 2%, at least, as you can see, is north of that now. It's going to continue to e-weight any cash reserves you might have. But if it's well managed, you can have an entity like the Grenfell Association or whatever the case might be that does, invest their money and does incredibly well with that money and does a lot of goodwill every year, and you don't have to panic to your founders every year for money. If anybody would like to talk about social enterprise, it's a much more complex entity, and I can talk about my work on the Shorefast Foundation perhaps after, but if there are any social enterprises in the room that want to talk about the legal, particularly the challenges around having a business or a social enterprise that makes money in a nonprofit space, I'm happy to talk about that ever. I have a 40-page deck here, but I won't bother you with that today, because I don't think the audience is generally a lot of social enterprises, as I understand it. Anyway. Thanks very much, everybody, and happy to answer any questions afterward as well. My colleague Christine is in the back. She's on the bank side. She knows how the banks work. I'm just the investment person.
So thanks very much, Josh. So we've had some really good details. I expect the burning question, I'm assuming the burning question might be, like, where do we get the money to start a fund in the first place? And what monies that we already have can legitimately be set aside for reserves. So I'll open the floor now for questions to the panel.
We're actually going to have a 10-minute break where the groups talk amongst themselves. No, we can do that too, where they talk amongst themselves about what kind of questions they might like to answer. But why don't we do a few questions now and then have the networking break in about 10 minutes time?
Yeah, that would be great. So that if there's anything hot in somebody's mind that they need to raise.
And I wouldn't mind also mentioning that there are some people in the room who actually have some experience with reserves, so I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but there might be some sharing around that as well. So go ahead with your questions, Ken.
Well, I'm just wondering if the audience has any questions.
More of a comment than a question. In the cultural sector, there's real pressure from basically the only funder, which is government, to create break-even budgets. And everybody knows that's ridiculous, but it would be really helpful if, because government has this stereotype of cultural professionals of not understanding money. We're very creative people, but just don't really get the business side of things. And so I'm just thinking if there was a way of having of what you've said today come from the business sector to government, because government values the opinion of the business sector in a way they don't value the opinion of, say, at least our corner of the nonprofit sector.
Which is the reason why I said right at the beginning that this is as much about philosophy and principles and the way in which our sector is treated. I mean, there's not a person who's running a business who isn't seen in a better light if they're making some profit, if they have some money to sustain them. Whereas in our world, not exclusively of course, but there's a little bit of this notion that, oh, you haven't managed well if you have a surplus, and perhaps the money you have can't be set aside. And that's the reason why I think the conversation is really important, because you made the comment, Jane, that most of your money is from government. So if it is money that's given to you to put in and to spend in a period of time. I think, Ken, you and I have maybe over time had this conversation. I think it might have been with you, where you're allowed only to have 2 or 3 months in the bank, or have I got you confused with, I may have you confused with somebody else,
No,
but,
that was a conversation
yeah.
a while back.
Yeah,
In our Heritage Owned Museum Association in Latin 150 museums. Government, as Jane was saying, just wants this break even. You're looking at, you can't generate revenues, which they all do. But, that's a real issue in the Heritage Department. They're looking at it saying they don't get that we are all nonprofit businesses, and the idea is that we function, generate revenues, and put it back into our businesses. That's a real struggle, and I think Jane was saying that they don't recognize that coming from us. If they heard it from the business world, oh.
so we have a bit of a game plan, which wasn't what I was going to talk about today, but the provincial government has agreed to initiate a process with the community sector, which is where we need to be having some of these conversations about the significant role that the sector plays in supporting the economy. And this is the very place where we need to be having the conversations around these policy issues. So within the next couple of weeks, you'll be hearing a lot more about our activities and how we're going to build some of these policy positions. But I think your point is really well taken, that people in the private sector, many of whom serve on our boards. Most of our boards very few of our boards would not have people who have good, solid business experience. So how do we convert the thinking, both within our own organizations and outside of our organizations, either to government funders or to other funders, that it's a good thing to be well managed and to be secure than a bad thing?
I think you need to have it explicitly stated in your documents. I mean, you like in my household example earlier, I mean, you try not to run your household so it's week to week or paycheck to paycheck. Another analogy, it's kind of a weird one, but it is an analogy. The last year or so, the federal government came out with these biggest changes that I've ever seen in 30 years in the corporate tax world. And they're saying that some of these companies have too much money, and they're going to tax them more heavily on it. Well, the CFIB, the Federation of Independent Business Guys, are saying, look, some of this money we actually had is for expansion and for these things. We can't, want a new plan to borrow the whole amount. We got to have cash reserves. I don't see how it should be any different and that was a very strong movement. I don't see why, the NPO sector shouldn't be saying the same thing. It's just prudent. The more often you say it, maybe they'll hear it.
Well, and it may also not be just a matter of saying it, but really framing it in a way that it resonates,
Sure.
that it makes sense.
I think, I draw sort of a parallel in the nonprofit world. Everybody, or not everybody, but a lot of people like to talk about the cost to raise a dollar. And, we're trying to flip that script because, just like a business, we have operating costs. We need to pay rent, we need to pay salaries, we need to pay a good living wage. We're not all volunteer driven. We have professionals within our organization, and we're doing good work. So instead of talking about the cost to raise a dollar, we're flipping that, and we need to talk about the impact that our work has directly on the community. So I think that, when you have a business, you talk about the benefits of your business to the community, and that's completely understood. Nobody goes and looks through the financial statements and says, oh, well, that one's making too much money, you're spending too much on salary, you're spending too much on this. So I think that this is a new way that we, as a people representing and working in the sector, need to reposition ourselves as, yes, it's the nonprofit, the not-for-profit, or the charitable sector, but that doesn't mean that we have to have bad business practices. We're operating businesses that just don't generate profits or dividends for shareholders.
How many people in the room actually have some sort of reserve set up in their organization? That's good.
Yeah.
So how did you manage to do it, and what kind of guidelines do you have around? Maybe we'll come over, somebody over here who hasn't spoken.
I'm with Newfoundland Member Association of Social Workers, but it was all really set up before I started, so I'm not quite So I'm not quite sure how it all came to be.
Paul, could you introduce yourself?
My name is Paul Toomey. I'm the executive director. I probably don't need this. I'm like Candace, so I'll hold it way out here.
You sound great.
I'm executive director of the Eating Disorder Foundation, and in addition to that, on my own volunteer side, I just finished an 8-year term as on board of directors of the Jack Byrne Regional Sport and Entertainment Complex. 5 of those years, which I was treasurer, and during that period of time, I did actually start the process of setting up some reserve funds for that organization. In the case of the Eating Disorder Foundation, the reason that the foundation has maintained some money is because in the early years, when the foundation was formed, and it's only an 11-year-old foundation, there were some additional funds put in by some benefactors, and as a result, within the first couple of years, the foundation was able to put some money away, albeit into just GICs. We haven't further invested. It's not a significant amount of money. We're talking about a $300,000 a year charity, so it's not a huge charity, but we do have. We've had up to $90,000 in reserve, and we've always had a number of discussions whether it's too much, is it enough, and how do we justify having that amount of money, which is effectively 1/3 of our annual budget in reserve. In the last couple of years, because of, I guess, the economic conditions and the ability not to be able to fundraise at the level that we could, or the grants didn't come through every year, we've had to dip into that reserve. And it's only now, in the last year, that we're realizing we don't really have any firm, solid policies in this area. So it's important for us to establish policies, how we dip into our reserve, when, and even we don't carry a line of credit. Maybe we would have been better off establishing a line of credit so that we didn't have to go into that 18-month GIC and take a penalty. So that's where we are with that, and so this is going to be very helpful in helping us establish policies. And I guess one of the questions that I have is, how do you know when you have enough money in a reserve? What's your guideline? And I guess I'll qualify that by saying I understand that there were different types of reserves. Taking JVR for a minute, we established 3 reserve funds. One is a capital fund designed for future needs, expansion, that sort of thing. The second one is a maintenance fund, in the sense that obviously it's an arena. Equipment's going to break down. Roofs are going to blow off in the wind, things like that, and insurance is not going to cover all of it. So we've set aside some of that. But the other one we had, because of the agreement we have with staff and employees, is that any employee who's around for 7 years is entitled to severance pay when they leave. So we put together a fund so that we've covered off that severance pay. So those are the 3 funds that we've restricted money to, and we did them on a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 basis a few years ago. We source that fund when we can through operating profits. If there is a profit or a surplus in a given year, then half of that is designated to go to those funds on a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 basis. So we think we've covered off a lot of that. We know that on a couple of those funds, we're nowhere near being where we need to be with the funding. Severance one, we seem to have that one figured out. From the foundation point of view, our biggest concerns are that day-to-day operation. What happens in the year when you don't, when your revenue doesn't exceed your expenses or falls below it? Maybe not one year, not so bad. When it happens a couple of years in a row because of the economic condition, when you dig into your funds, how do you know you have enough? What happens in the case of if you have to wind down your foundation, or if you have to move along? How much money do you need to have in reserve to be able to do a proper wind down of an organization? So those are some of the questions and comments that I would have. So I'd probably ask the panel if they want to comment on some of those before we go any further.
I'd just like to pick up on your one that you referred to as your staff severance. That's how we capture our thinking around our liability and contingency fund, but they're not only obligations we have to employees for a variety of things. One of the things that we learned, this is just a sidebar, a few years ago, there were a number of organizations who had very strong policies in place for their employees. When those organizations folded, they couldn't meet their obligations. So that fund that you refer to is where you already have existing obligations. And so, for example, when you're getting near the end of a 5-year lease, you don't have a very significant lease obligation. If you're signing a new 5-year lease, you have a very significant obligation. And so it is about how you manage but that money can be earmarked. Like you can spell out why that money is in your fund. I think then when we get into the other ones that we need to give the organization some flexibility. But the liability one to me is really where you have to start. Because how can a board take on obligations if they don't have the resources to meet those obligations? I mean, it's a bizarre undertaking. The investment piece that you mentioned, CSC caught on to that quite early, that if we had money, then we needed to find a way to invest it. And so we have an asset mix that we review from time to time. So we have equities and bonds, and we have cash, and we just make those decisions depending on where we think we can make money and where the market is going, so that we can protect our funds somewhat. And so that might be something interesting, Josh, for you to pick up on, because an investment fund doesn't have to be complicated.
Yep.
But it needs to be in place, otherwise the board has no way of making its decisions or knowing whether it should move or not move.
Yeah, exactly. So I showed you the worst case scenario, the lowest possible rate, the GIC rate, or the downside. But yeah, if you're a well-managed, I mean, if you look at the big examples, maybe to Tumi's point, around what the endowments of Harvard and Yale, they've actually struggled the last couple of years because they've maybe been a little too complex in how they've allocated. But you can be very simple with it in terms of having some, there's a lot of low-risk products out there that return, 4, 5, 6% a year, and they're not legally guaranteed. They won't be around if they don't perform well. So the asset mix is essential. And I think to Mr. Toomey's question about how much should you do, you can look at the actuarial tables, but if you look at, I guess the example he uses the MUN scholarships we've been heavily involved with for a long time. I think when I set up my first scholarship when I graduated from undergrad, we made a class gift, and I think we only needed to give $18,000 a year. That would give a $500 or $700, $1,000 scholarship every year, depending on how the market did. And that number is north of 20,000 now. But if you give 20,000, then every year you will, the XYZ scholarship of whatever you're chosen will donate another $1,000 back. So that is scalable and ratable. But you need to look at the actuarial tables. They move. It's the market. It's a live number. It always changes. So I can't tell you this is the number that you should use, because it will change every year based on returns. The bond market has been, GICs used to give you 10%. They don't do that anymore. So you need to be able to change and pivot to Penny's point. Your asset allocation mix needs to change with the market as things become more valuable or less valuable.
So I think it's 3:05 now, Darlene, so we might want to take our break now.
Yes, and the goal of the break is to do some networking, meet some new people if you haven't met anybody who's at your table. But also we have on your table some worksheets around questions, because we're not only giving you the opportunity to ask the questions of the panelists, the Community Sector Council is also very interested, if we don't get to answer all the questions, for example, in pursuing this topic and perhaps looking for additional opportunities to do something semi-public like we're doing today. So let's have a little break, have some nourishment, and I'll call us back together in about 12 minutes time. And by that time, it would be great if you had some really pointed questions and you knew who you wanted to ask on the panel to answer the question.
Or if you want to make statements that nobody on the panel can answer.
Well, you could absolutely do that. We would be delighted at that, yes. Don't feel reined in whatsoever just simply because we call them questions. Questions and comments are very welcome.
And ways forward.
And ways forward. Okay, so lift up, move around, meet some people, grab another coffee or a juice, and then we'll be back together in a few minutes, okay? Thanks. Okay, folks, what we're going to try to do now is accomplish a couple of things. Obviously give you an opportunity to ask questions of your learned panel. You've heard them speak, and they've all said they'll answer questions as best they can. If this is like any other topic that we've raised, there's always undercurrents. Oh, hey, we didn't talk about this, we didn't talk about that. And So if you've got a burning question, you can scratch it down if you want, or you can just ask for the mic and ask the question. So Penny's going to chair that portion, and then just before 4 o'clock, I'm going to ask Shelley to come up and talk to you about FM Share, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the name of the network that we're putting together of people who manage finances in the nonprofit sector. We're doing that actually in St. John's, and we're trying to do it in Gander as well, because this is a pilot project. So, Shelley has mic in hand, Penny's ready to chair, so hopefully you've got some questions, and I'm going to turn it back over to the panel.
So I'm assuming that there may be an array of questions. I know, for instance, at the end, Paul was talking about how you develop policies. And I think that sometimes there's a tendency just to have the money and not have the policies. That may be a subject you'd like to talk about. You might like to talk about what funding that you have is eligible to be transferred into a fund. Or you may just be thinking about how to establish a fund. So the floor is open, and you can direct your questions if you want to, or if you merely want to make a comment, that's fine too. Phew. That was good.
Thank you.
Would you introduce yourself?
My name is Kevin O'Shea. I'm from the Public Legal Information Association. And I'm Kelly Brockerville is here from Plan as well. And we were talking at the break about really just trying to think about how we get started with developing a reserve policy and thinking about creating a reserve fund. We have never had one in our history at Plan. We've had some conversations with our board about it, but we're not really sure how we get started. So any tips that the panel has for that, just that the first steps we would need to take in thinking about creating a reserve fund. And as associated with that is one of the challenges we see with our organization. Most of our funding is externally restricted. Majority of our funding comes from project-based funds that really can only be spent on those projects. We don't have that flexibility to put in potentially to a reserve fund. And even our core funding from government tends to be pretty restricted. So how can we, as part of crafting a reserve policy, look at what funds we can draw on to create a reserve as one of those initial starting steps?
Josh.
Thank you.
I'm happy to take that.
Just take the whole thing.
Just do a little test first, Josh.
Anybody?
Make sure it's on.
Nothing, okay. I'll speak loudly.
Shelley, give him the mic that you have.
No.
It was working, Josh.
The light's on, it looks green,
The light
it
is
looks
on.
great. Thanks for the question. I'm happy to send you a number of investment policy statements, which is basically key language you would have to present to a board that would say, this is how we plan to treat reserves. Where, usually they'll say a lot of keywords like we're going to be very conservative. We will try to spend at a 4% rate or based on whatever the case would be. So I'm happy to send you a bunch of mock-ups of those. I think I can do that, but I will do it for you. To your question about being specific to run project-based, I guess I'll use the example of my volunteer work at the Grenfell board. We had a bunch of benefactors who donated, sometimes their life savings or a lot of things to the running of the Curtis Hospital in St. Anthony. That was when the Grenfell Association ran the Curtis Hospital. We eventually sold that to the government for $1, but we were able through the legal framework we set out to say that these funds would go to continue to support the Curtis Hospital to this day. So we still invest that money in the market every year, and those funds every year go to buy new materials for the health in the region, because the Curtis Hospital, I don't think it's still called the Curtis Hospital, but we still do as long as it sticks within the same merit of the benefactor who donated the funds, then we are legally allowed to do that. That's how we set that up. So I don't know if that helps you, but that's kind of where my mind goes with that, and I'll let Brian run with the other side.
I don't know about the other side or not. What organization are you with again?
Public Legal Information Association.
Okay, so what do you do exactly?
Legal education. It's a good question. We're not sure sometimes ourselves. No, legal education work across the property.
To benefit the general public?
For the general public, yeah.
Okay. So, do you have an idea in mind as to what you'd want the reserve fund for, would be my first comment.
Primarily liability contingency, I think, as a starting step. And then I think to look at setting, a few months aside in case all of our funding drops out or we run into a crisis where we can cover our expenses for, 3-6 months. The exact amount I'm not sure, but that's really where we're looking.
Yeah. So at the risk of getting myself in great trouble, I would be looking, for example, to the law firms here in St. John's. I mean, a while ago, there was a bit of a real estate thing with Miles Leger, and all of a sudden now when you do a land deal, there's a $50 charge or whatever to build up an insurance fund for the lawyers. So I think, it would be a sort of a good public thing for them to do and talk to them about go to the Law Society and see if maybe they can.
We do get some funding from the Law Society in the last couple of years.
Should ask for more.
One of the handouts in here has some information in there about it, and they talk about, special gifts, like, if you were to go to the Law Society. So sometimes you can get grants from, particular stakeholders specifically for operating reserves, or you can, take it, when Penny was talking earlier about surpluses, have a policy that you'll take X percentage of any, surplus, unless you have to return those funds.
Yeah.
So just to answer your question from an organizational perspective, as I think your question was, how do you get the board to even start talking about this conversation? And I can still see the day sitting in our boardroom when we started to have the conversation. And the board had to buy into the concept that this is something smart for us to do. And most boards are going to agree with that. You as the executive director probably need to do some homework to bring it in and say this is what other organizations are doing. But we were very explicit at the beginning. We said we want to have X amount in our fund, and these are the steps we will take to build the fund. And oh, by the way, this is the condition under which the fund can be used. And it had to be a board decision with 2/3 vote. It couldn't just be 50 plus 1. And so our policy is less than a page, and but it's very clear. And every few years we will go back and review it. What we learned very quickly was that we got to our ceiling faster than we thought. So we said, well, this is not enough, we'll increase the ceiling. And then following the suggestion that Josh made, we will occasionally go back and say, well, if we had $200,000 10 years ago, we need $230,000 now to be able to keep it stable. Once we developed our first fund, we said, that was good, that was easy. Oh, maybe we should have another fund. And the other fund has a very different purpose. So one fund is to protect the organization for expenses and liabilities that it might have. And the other one is explicitly, and again, board policy with very clear procedures about how the fund will be built, once we attain the fund, how it will be spent, and how it will be invested. And it's not rocket science. I mean, these are little policies. And we just keep track of when we change them, when we update them. The board is on top of what the policies are. It was easy peasy. I think sometimes when we're trying to do new things, we try to make it far more complicated than it is. In today's world, the challenge may be where the money comes from, because things were a little bit easier perhaps some time ago, but also we had money that we felt were our funds to divert to project funds and to liability funds, because we had a social enterprise that was generating a fair amount of money. I think it might be a little bit more challenging now, but to Brian's point, well, if this is something that's important and you can make a case, go to the people who should be supporting what you're doing. That may not be the only source of your revenues, but it could be a reasonable source. And what I really liked about what we did is we said, once we reach the ceiling, any profits, any interest in the run of a year come back into operating funds, so it had a dual purpose. So are there any other questions? I noticed a lot of you put your hands up when I asked, do you have reserve funds? So how did you develop your funds? What advice could you give to your colleagues?
hide it in the bank. Put it under the mattress.
Don't do that.
So are there any, sorry, Jane and then Clara.
This is not about develop reserve. In the museum world, there's always lots of talk about endowments.
Yes.
I have personal opinions about who and when should start an endowment, but I would just be interested in what the experts have to say about the value of endowments and when in your organizational cycle you're ready to have one or not.
I personally love the idea of endowments. I think they're great. I won a lot of scholarships from endowments, so I have a real soft spot in my heart for them. But you do have to put a big effort into raising that money initially, right? You need to probably, save some money and make a big effort, a big fundraising event to make that money. But once it's endowed, it does carry on ideally in perpetuity. So I'm personally a big benefactor of those. The interesting trend we've seen in the investment world lately has been particularly around socially responsible investing. So certain people don't want their funds to go into certain corporations, and that's been a big trend. So if you're the arts organization, or whether you're the Nature Conservatory, whatever it is, you can set up investment policies or tools that are endowed that will only benefit and only be invested in companies that are responsible and have good direction, female directors on the board. There's a lot of benefits to that as well. Use the resources, but endowments I'm a big fan of. I can't actually think of why you wouldn't want to do it, but I'd love to hear why you don't want to do it.
If anybody else on the panel has any thoughts on that.
I just want to ask a question, so you go ahead and ask yours, and I'll come back to ask Josh a question about endowment funds.
Oh, no.
Go ahead. One of the things that I've run into over the years is when people set up an endowment fund that makes sense when they set it up. And over time, the purpose for the endowment changes. And it's really challenging to get back to the root of the investment to see how you can transfer it. And I mean, I'm going to use an example, which is not nearly as far-fetched as it's going to sound. But I remember when I was setting up a Boys and Girls Club here in St. John's, and we were setting it up in a school. And we wanted access to money to send some kids to camp, to buy them sneakers and to do things. And one of the groups we were working with had all kinds of endowment funds, all kinds of money in it, and they really wanted to help out. They really wanted to help buy the sneakers and get whatever the kids needed to go to camp. But the funds were so tied up. It was like, as I recall, it was for redhead girls with green eyes who were the age of 12 and 13. And that money was just sitting and sitting and sitting. And it couldn't be accessed. And another one that was set up at the university, which was probably important 80 years ago, it was so that young men, not young women, young men who came into St. John's and who wanted to go to some social events or concerts or whatever, needed to have a tuxedo, black tie, right? And so at the time, it was a very important, but the fund was growing and growing and growing, and there was never a drain on the fund. So how do you redirect your endowment funds?
Yes, that's particularly comes to your investment policy statement. So you need to, the more restricted you make it, and sometimes donors and benefactors will say very specific things like pennies and stuff, and that makes it very challenging to change. So I agree, you're absolutely right. They could be, they can tie up money and just compounding interest, making money, but know where to spend it. That's troubling. You want to make sure that, and when you're setting these up, that you can say, at the discretion of the board or discretion of the CEO to make allocations differently. That's good board practice. But sometimes if you have some eccentric people that want to help redheads with green eyes,
in perpetuity,
you're in trouble.
But I believe that there was at some point where none of the people who established it were even alive still. And there was some process that was enacted. But I think the point is that people did these things with all the right motivations, and it's probably what you're trying to get to. And then at some point, there needs to be some readjustment.
My argument against endowments is that a lot of times organizations that haven't developed liquid unrestricted assets decide, let's create an endowment. And so they go fundraise or they get a donor to give, a pot of money. But, they're technically, they're capital rich, but there's no liquidity. They don't have
And
the
not enough
day-to-day-
interest.
And, yeah, not enough interest, and they don't have the day-to-day money to keep the organization running.
Yeah.
But on the books, it looks like they're, you know, they've got lots of cash in the bank.
Yeah, and that's the difference between endowments and just a regular investment account, whereas you can change and pivot on that, whereas endowment is generally associated with a benefactor of some form. So yeah, you can do it the other way, where it's just you need to take the money out of the market, you can get your money within 24 hours.
The challenge in the museum sector is that, well, for arts organizations, there's a federal government program that if you raise money for an endowment fund, the federal government will match it dollar for dollar. So it's great.
Right.
But it's not great if you're accumulating an endowment.
Right.
And you don't have the money for the day-to-day.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's a really important conversation though, and especially if it's where it's being matched.
Yes.
Right, there's
government
such a
funds,
temptation to go in that direction, and then to what end?
yes, exactly.
I'd love to know how much is sitting in endowments in the province, to know it.
Well, not much of that money comes to Newfoundland, but
But there could be endowments in all kinds of other ways that we're not aware of.
Just not so much endowments, just restricted contributions. I've seen examples though where, for whatever reason, things change in the organization, and what they initially intended to do with the money, they want to now switch, and they've gone back to some of these donors and got their permission to spend the money elsewhere. So.
As far as your financial statements go, the assets that you have in your endowment fund are presented separately on the statements, so that funders or the government, when they look at them, realize that those assets are tied up and they aren't the same as liquid cash. And you'll have a policy in your financial statements, or you should, explicitly saying the restrictions on that endowment. So if it is an endowment that's very restricted, then it's less liquid, or you're less likely to use it than if it's something with a lot broader scope.
And it's a little bit like the difference between a community foundation and United Way.
Yeah.
What you raise, you spend, and the
Yeah.
community foundation raises it for much longer term investments, and that's one of the huge distinctions.
I would imagine the university would be a prime example of endowment funds that probably are tied up because they're very restricted. If somebody set up when the university was established, something for, young men from Cape Ray who no longer wanted to work on the railroad to go to university.
And in a tuxedo for dinner.
Right. So, I think that the biggest learning is if we were to set up an endowment fund, is to make sure that you have, as a part of your policy in agreement, it has to be a part of your donor agreement about the use of those funds or any change in use of the funds.
Could I come back to a point that Kevin raised, because it may apply to a fair number of people in the room? Typically, not so much now, but as in years gone by, when you'd apply for a grant, whether it was government or elsewhere, there was always an understanding that you could take 10% or 12% or 15% or whatever for administration. And that was fairly loose money a lot of the time. So in many ways, that's where CSC was able to say, okay, we're going to put a little levy on all of these administration funds, and over time we were able to put it in. But what I'm finding now is a lot more of the grants not only say you can have 10%, but by the way, you will have to report to us on every cent of how you spend that administration fund. So in part, these may be policy conversations as well, because in some way, all of our organizations need something, whether it's for current expenditure or future expenditure, that's not fettered. Otherwise, you can't breathe, you can't change direction, you can't do any proper planning, you can't build a new strategic direction for your organization unless somebody's going to fund it directly. So, I think that some of these issues that you're raising, that we're surfacing, we really need to take into account, because maybe there are some policy changes we need to be pushing in order to be able to get where we want to go.
I'm going to make a comment on that, Penny. One of the things I notice is in government-funded, non-governmental organizations, the government wants your labor at exact cost. We never, or rarely, do we ever tack on 15 or 20% like we would in business world. Here's what that labor's costing us. Okay, so let's charge, the government $10 more per hour for that skill set.
I think we all got to get a lot smarter.
And that's one of the bases of any RFP the government presents, is that a contractor is out there, they're bidding on, electrical services, and there's probably a 100% profit put on the wage they're paying the person who does it. But for us, it's one for one.
So, this is really interesting. It comes back to the very first point you raised, Jane, about we probably need people in the business sector to teach us how to do this. So, maybe you panelists will be getting a call again in the near future to maybe come along with some of your colleagues or people who you think could give us good advice. Maybe this is where we could sit down and have some quiet conversations about how we change the message. Which says that, we're going to be doing fundamental and essential services and activities in our community, and they're going to be considered important and central to the province, then we need to be able to frame that message differently. So that would be really helpful to have some of these things come to bear. These are things you can do, these are things you can't do, and this is the message versus this is the mechanics of how you do things. Yes? Was that a hand?
Me?
Yeah, no. Anyway, I think, Darlene, we've probably,
There was one additional question.
oh, Claire, sorry, I
Oh, no,
forgot
I'm fine, that's.
Okay.
you. You sure?
Yeah.
You got her so?
Come on. No, I was just asking if people had why you started operational reserve funds, right? That was the question, but I think we went off on it. But that's fine.
Anyway, so it's all good. Darlene is going to finish us up, but let me just say thank you to each of you for coming and sharing your wisdom. I think we've probably just scratched the surface. I know that there are one or two things that I have to follow up on, but I don't necessarily need to do it at this particular moment. But for those of you in the room, let us know if you think these are important issues, because there are the issues of how you actually set up and maintain your fund. And then I think there is the bigger issue about how sometimes funders can be, and others can be detrimental to the process. And that's not, I don't mean that quite so negatively as it sounds, but it is important to be able to frame what we're doing in a way that makes sense to the people who we're getting support from, including the public.
Thank you all for coming.
Yes, and thank you all very much. So just before I formally thank the panel for being with us and agreeing to answer questions, I would like to point out that Nashaba has their business cards. So if you haven't picked up their business cards and want them, they're free for the asking. Nashaba sits back in the room there. So I'm going to ask Shelley to come up and just spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about one of the sheets of paper that's on your table, and that's the one about FM share. But additionally, if you haven't used the question sheet yet, and you still do have questions that you think, for example, the Community Sector Council might do some organizing around, Penny mentioned policy issues, somebody mentioned investment. If there are other issues that you would like us to address, put that on the questions paper. But I'm going to just ask Shelley to spend a couple of minutes on FM share, and then I'm going to come back and formally thank the panel.
Thank you, Darlene. So it's the first chance I've had to speak yet today. So most of you, I think, do know me. I'm Shelley Martin. I am a CPA, trained CA, and I've been working with the Community Sector Council on the Buy the Books project, which is a project, it's a pilot project, basically meant to, I guess, enhance and share financial management knowledge across the nonprofit sector. So we've been doing this in numerous ways. We've had lots of skills building activities. We're creating a directory, as Darlene had mentioned earlier, of service providers. So if you as a nonprofit are looking for an accountant or an advisor or a bookkeeper or some capacity, then we're preparing a directory that you could use to help you find that service. And one of the things that we're, I guess, looking into this pilot project is the need, desire to have a network of financial management practitioners, if you will, in the nonprofit sector. So anyone involved in making financial management decisions, people with experience who can maybe share some of their experiences and best practices with other groups, maybe smaller groups that don't often have the funds to hire at levels that they would like to hire at with respect to financial management. And that's what this sheet of paper is all about today, the Let's Connect. So we're looking at creating this network of financial management professionals or practitioners. On LinkedIn, we've debated various mediums, recognizing that there has to be something. We've done some focus groups, and people have indicated that they'd like it to be as organic as possible, but also recognizing that there has to be a medium where people can congregate and communicate. So on the sheet that we handed out, if you're interested in becoming part of this financial management network, FM Share, so it's financial managers sharing helpful advice, resources, and experiences. You can go ahead and fill this sheet out and just leave it on the table. There's a section here for, obviously your contact information is on the forefront. There's also a really important section in the middle whereby we'd like to know what you want to know about with respect to financial management in nonprofits and charities. And CSC may decide to address some of these items. As you know, they've spent years and years and years trying to figure out how to help community organizations grow. So we're just trying to figure out what would you like to know about. And it may be something that we can address through a network as well. So I think that's it. Thank you for coming.
Yes, thanks everybody for being here. So I promised you that we'd be out by 4 o'clock, and we are. I'm going to beg the panel's indulgence while I take a picture while they're still sitting there. But I would like to really give them a heartfelt thank you. They're all here as volunteers today. They've taken their time to give to us, and I think it's a really strong indication of when you reach out and ask people to help, they're there for you. So I really appreciate the time and effort that everybody put into prepping for today, giving us resource materials, and answering the questions. So I think it would be appropriate if we gave our panel a round of applause.